The rusty hinges screamed in protest as I pushed open the door of what the lawyer had called my inheritance. Tyler pressed against my side, his 8-year-old hand gripping mine with the kind of trust that made my chest ache. In my other arm, 14-month-old Emma squirmed, too young to understand that the collapsing wooden structure before us represented everything we had left in the world. The October wind whipped through gaps in the weathered siding, and I could see daylight through holes in the roof. This wasn't a home. It was barely a shelter. And according to Richard Hartwell's coldly satisfied smile as he'd handed me the keys 3 hours ago, it was worth exactly nothing. What I didn't know then, as Tyler whispered those words that would change everything, "Mama, is this really ours?" was that beneath the rotting floorboards of this worthless shack lay evidence of $100 million legacy, my dead husband's true identity, and the reason he'd been murdered on a mountain road 6 months ago. My name is Sarah Chun and I'm 34 years old. 6 months ago, I was a medical illustrator living in Seattle with my husband David, our son Tyler, and baby Emma. We weren't wealthy, but we were happy, building a life one paycheck at a time. Then David's car went off a cliff on a routine business trip to Montana. The police called it an accident, brake failure on a mountain road. But David's last text message, sent just 2 hours before he died, told a different story. "If anything happens to me, go to Ravenswood. The truth is in the groundskeeper's cottage. Trust no one from my father's family." I'd known David had a complicated relationship with his father's family. He'd been raised by his mother's relatives in Arizona after she died in an archaeological accident when he was young. His father, Nathaniel Hartwell, had been a stranger until a deathbed reconciliation 3 years ago. David never talked much about the Hartwells, except to say they were old Boston money and wanted nothing to do with him. When Nathaniel died, David attended the funeral alone, returning quiet and withdrawn, refusing to discuss what had happened. Now David was gone too, and the only thing his father's family had given us was this collapsing shack on the edge of their Massachusetts estate. The structure that the Hartwell family lawyer had formerly called the groundskeeper's cottage looked like it might blow over in a strong wind. The single room measured maybe 15 by 20 feet, with a loft space accessible by a ladder so rotted I wouldn't let Tyler near it. There was no plumbing, no electricity, and a stone fireplace that looked like it might collapse if you breathed on it wrong. Through the grimy window, I could see the main house, Ravenswood Manor, sitting like a mansion from a Gothic novel about a quarter-mile away through the woods. That house, with its turrets and manicured gardens, belonged to Richard Hartwell, Nathaniel's legitimate son from his marriage to the socially prominent Catherine Blackwell. This shack was apparently all David's illegitimate son was worth. "It's like a fort, Mama," Tyler said with the optimism of a child who didn't yet understand how badly our lives had fallen apart. "Can we camp here tonight? Like an adventure?" I wanted to cry. Instead, I forced a smile. "Maybe, buddy. Let's explore first." Emma had fallen asleep against my shoulder, exhausted from the long flight from Seattle and the drive out to the estate. I laid her carefully on the only piece of furniture, a dusty wooden bench, using my jacket as a cushion. Then Tyler and I began examining our inheritance. The floorboards creaked ominously with each step, several broken or missing entirely. The stone fireplace dominated one wall, its massive construction seeming almost too large for such a small building. Tyler immediately began exploring it with the focused intensity he'd inherited from David. "Mom, look, some of these stones move," Tyler called out, his small fingers working at a stone near the fireplace base. "Dad told me about places like this. Old buildings sometimes have hiding spots for important stuff." My heart clenched. David had shared so many stories with Tyler, archaeological tales about hidden chambers and secret documents. I thought they were just bedtime stories. Now I wondered what else David had been trying to tell our son. I knelt beside Tyler, examining the stone he'd loosened. It shifted under pressure, revealing a hollow space behind. Inside was nothing but dust and a single tarnished coin. But Tyler's discovery sparked something. A memory of David's text message. "The truth is in the groundskeeper's cottage." "Tyler, those stories Dad told you about secret hiding places. Do you remember what he said about how to find them?" Tyler scrunched his face in concentration. "He said the old builders made hiding spots near fireplaces because people expected those to be solid. And he said sometimes there were bigger spaces, like rooms underneath, for hiding really important stuff during wars and things. I examined the fireplace more carefully. Its construction was elaborate, far more substantial than necessary for such a modest building. The stone floor around it seemed oddly level compared to the rest of the cottage's sagging foundation. And when I stomped on the boards, the sound changed near the fireplace, more hollow, more resonant. Tyler noticed too, his eyes widening with excitement. It's like the stories, Mom. There's something under here. We spent the next 30 minutes examining every inch of the floor near the fireplace. Tyler's small fingers found what mine might have missed. A seam in the floorboards so fine it was almost invisible, forming a rectangular outline about 3 feet wide. When I pressed hard on one corner, the opposite corner lifted slightly, revealing hidden hinges. Help me, Tyler. On 3 we pulled together. The trapdoor resisted, swollen with age and moisture, but finally gave way with a groan that made Emma stir and whimper in her sleep. Beneath was not a shallow crawl space, but a stone staircase descending into darkness. My phone's flashlight revealed perhaps 10 steps leading to what appeared to be a small underground room. The air rising from below was cool, dry, and carried the distinct smell of old paper. Stay with Emma, I instructed Tyler, though I could see the disappointment in his face. I'll check if it's safe first. The stairs were solid stone, worn smooth by age but structurally sound. The chamber below measured roughly 12 feet square. Its walls lined with metal shelving that looked far more modern than the cottage above. And on those shelves sat dozens of archival boxes, leather-bound journals and document tubes, all meticulously labeled and organized. One box, positioned at eye level directly opposite the stairs, bore a label in handwriting I recognized immediately, David's. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a letter, dated 1 week before David's death, addressed to me. Sarah, asterisk. If you're reading this, then I didn't make it back from Montana, and you've been smart enough to find what I hid here. I'm so sorry for keeping secrets, but I needed to be certain before I told you everything. My father, Nathaniel Hartwell, was legally married to my mother, Elizabeth Chun, before he ever married Catherine Blackwell. That makes me his legitimate first son, not Richard. This room contains proof. The original marriage certificate, my birth records, and most importantly, evidence that Richard knew about this all along and has been systematically hiding it to maintain control of the Hartwell fortune. Asterisk. The estate and the company are worth over $100 million, Sarah. Under the original inheritance laws governing Ravenswood, it should all pass to me, not Richard. That's why Richard tried to buy me off with this worthless cottage when Dad died. He knew the cottage sits on the old estate's most significant ground, and he knew Dad had used it as his private archive. Richard's been searching for this room for 3 years. That's why the cottage has been deliberately neglected, why he kept offering to demolish it, as a favor, while pushing the worthless property on us. Asterisk. Be careful. Richard eliminated obstacles before. I found evidence that my mother's archaeological accident wasn't an accident at all. I'm going to Montana to interview the last living witness. If I don't come back, you'll know Richard found out. Protect our children. Use this evidence to claim what's theirs. I love you more than anything. Asterisk. David asterisk. The room seemed to tilt around me. David had known he was in danger. He'd hidden this evidence and walked into a trap anyway, trying to secure one last piece of proof. The brake failure that killed him was no accident, it was murder. And I was standing in the murdered man's archive, holding evidence that would make me the next target. I grabbed the box labeled with David's handwriting, and climbed back up to find Tyler standing guard over his sleeping sister with a piece of broken board held like a weapon. Is it treasure, Mom? Something like that, baby. Something Daddy left for us. But we need to be very, very careful about who we tell. The sound of a car engine approaching sent both of us to the window. A black Mercedes pulled up outside, and Richard Hartwell emerged, his expensive suit looking absurdly out of place in front of the dilapidated cottage. He wasn't alone. A woman in equally expensive clothes followed, along with 2 men in suits that screamed private security, rather than estate staff. Richard's knock was perfunctory, barely waiting for a response before pushing the door open. His eyes swept the room, lingering on the open trapdoor before settling on me with poorly concealed calculation. Mrs. Chun, I hope you're not planning to actually stay here. The structure is unsound. I've brought paperwork for you to sign, transferring the property back to the estate in exchange for a settlement of $50,000. More than fair for a building worth nothing. I thought of David's letter, of the evidence beneath my feet, of the $100 million legacy Richard was trying to steal with a $50,000 bribe. I think we'll keep it, actually. It has sentimental value. Something flickered in Richard's eyes, cold and dangerous. Mrs. Chun, be reasonable. You have 2 small children. This isn't safe accommodation. Sign the papers. Take the money. Go back to Seattle and build a new life. Or what? The words came out before I could stop them. Richard's smile never reached his eyes. Or you'll find that fighting the Hartwell family is expensive, exhausting, and ultimately futile. We protect what's ours. After they left, with me refusing to sign anything, I knew I had perhaps 24 hours before Richard escalated. I photographed everything in the underground chamber, uploaded it to an encrypted cloud account, and then made 3 phone calls. The first was to my best friend in Seattle, asking her to keep digital copies of everything. The second was to a lawyer whose name David had written in his letter, a woman named Patricia Morrison who specialized in estate fraud cases. The third was to the Massachusetts State Police, reporting my suspicion that my husband's death was not an accident. Patricia Morrison arrived at a diner in town 3 hours later, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who listened to my story without interruption while I showed her photographs on my phone. When I finished, she sat back and studied me carefully. You understand what you're alleging? That Richard Hartwell, one of Boston's most prominent businessmen, murdered your husband to hide inheritance fraud. I understand that my husband is dead, his mother died in a suspicious accident 30 years ago, and Richard Hartwell just threatened me in front of witnesses when I wouldn't sign away property he claims is worthless. Patricia's expression shifted to something like respect. The evidence is compelling, but we need the physical documents, not just photographs. Courts prefer originals. Can you secure them? They're in the cottage. Richard knows about the room now. He saw the trapdoor. Then we move fast. I'll file emergency petitions first thing tomorrow morning. Court orders to preserve the site and prevent any construction or modification. Can you get the children somewhere safe tonight? I thought of Tyler's brave face and Emma's innocent sleep. I'll figure it out. That night, we slept in a motel outside Lexington, the box from David's hiding place secured in the trunk of our rental car. I barely slept, jerking awake at every sound, imagining Richard's security team breaking in to steal the evidence. By morning, I'd made my decision. If Richard wanted a fight, he was about to discover that a widow with nothing left to lose was far more dangerous than he'd calculated. Patricia's emergency filings hit the court at 9 a.m. By 10:30, we had temporary preservation orders preventing any modification to the cottage or its grounds. By noon, Richard's attorneys had filed countermotions claiming I was making fraudulent claims to extort the family. By 2 p.m., the state police investigators looking into David's death had enough questions about the brake failure to reopen the case as a possible homicide. By 4 p.m., Richard knew he was in a fight he might actually lose. The preliminary hearing happened 3 days later. Richard arrived with 4 attorneys and an attitude of offended aristocracy. I arrived with Patricia, a box of David's hidden evidence, and the absolute certainty that I was fighting for my children's birthright and their father's vindication. Judge Catherine Walsh, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, reviewed the evidence with the kind of careful attention that made Richard's lead attorney visibly nervous. The marriage certificate between Nathaniel Hartwell and Elizabeth Chun, dated 1985, 2 years before Nathaniel's marriage to Catherine Blackwell. David's birth certificate listing both parents. Letters between Nathaniel and Elizabeth discussing their son. Most damaging of all was Nathaniel's private journal, discovered in that underground room, where he'd written explicitly about Richard's discovery of the first marriage and Richard's threats to destroy the family socially if Nathaniel acknowledged David publicly. The final entries, written just months before Nathaniel's death, express fear that Richard had been involved in Elizabeth's accident, and explicit instructions for David to claim his rightful inheritance once Nathaniel was gone. "Mr. Hartwell," Judge Walsh said, her voice cutting through the courtroom's tense silence. "Can you explain why your father's private papers, which should have been part of the estate inventory, were hidden in a cottage you described as worthless? And why you failed to disclose the existence of your father's first marriage during probate proceedings?" Richard's attorney objected, argued, maneuvered, but couldn't explain away the physical evidence. The hearing ended with court orders freezing all Hartwell estate assets pending full investigation, forensic accounting of all transactions since Nathaniel's death, and protection orders preventing Richard from approaching me or the children. Walking out of that courthouse, Tyler looked up at me with David's eyes and asked, "Did we win, Mama?" "The first round, baby. But we're just getting started." The full legal battle took 18 months. 18 months of depositions, document reviews, forensic investigations, and increasingly desperate moves by Richard as the weight of evidence mounted against him. The Montana witness David had been trying to interview came forward after reading about the case, providing testimony that Richard had contacted him weeks before David's visit, asking questions about David's travel plans. The forensic investigation of David's car found evidence of deliberate brake line tampering. Elizabeth Chen's death investigation was reopened, revealing similar suspicious circumstances and financial transactions linking Richard to payments made to site personnel shortly after her fatal fall. The criminal charges came first: evidence tampering, fraud, and eventually, 2 counts of criminally negligent homicide in the deaths of Elizabeth Chen and David Chen Hartwell. Richard's conviction on the fraud and evidence charges was swift. The homicide charges remained under investigation, with Richard now facing potential murder charges as evidence continued to mount. The civil case concluded with Judge Walsh's comprehensive ruling recognizing David as Nathaniel's legitimate first son and Tyler as his heir. The ruling transferred control of the estate, including Ravenswood Manor and the controlling interest in Hartwell Enterprises, to a trust managed by me on Tyler's behalf until he reached majority age. The valuation came to $127 million in assets, property, and business holdings. Richard's final words, shouted across the courtroom as he was led away after the verdict, showed the true nature beneath his aristocratic facade. "That cottage was never worthless. I knew what was under it. It should have been mine." Today, 2 years after opening that rusty door on what I thought was a worthless shack, Tyler and Emma run through Ravenswood's gardens while I watch from the restored groundskeeper's cottage. We kept the cottage, renovated and preserved as David's memorial. The underground chamber is now a climate-controlled archive, holding not just the evidence that secured our children's inheritance, but David's archaeological research, his mother's papers, and a growing collection documenting the true history of the Hartwell family, both the achievements and the crimes. The main house has been partially converted into a foundation supporting archaeological research and legal aid for families fighting inheritance fraud. David would have liked that, using the wealth to help others uncover hidden truths. Tyler, now 10 years old, already talks about becoming an archaeologist like his dad. He understands more than most children his age about justice, truth, and the importance of protecting what matters. Sometimes I stand in that doorway where Tyler first asked, "Mama, is this really ours?" and remember how my heart broke at the sight of that collapsing structure. I thought Richard had given us nothing, a worthless shack on worthless land, a final insult to David's memory. What he'd actually given us was the key to everything, the one piece of the estate he couldn't demolish or sell without revealing what lay beneath. His arrogance had been his downfall, assuming we'd never look, never find, never fight. David's last letter, now framed in my office, ends with a line I read whenever I doubt myself. "The truth is like hidden treasure, Sarah. Sometimes you have to dig through layers of lies to find it, but once you bring it into the light, no one can bury it again." The rusty hinges on the cottage door have been replaced, but I kept them as a reminder. When they screamed in protest that first day, they were announcing not just our arrival at what seemed like the end of our story, but the beginning of uncovering a truth that would change everything. The worthless shack that Richard threw at us as a dismissive gesture turned out to be the most valuable piece of the entire estate, not because of the land it sat on, but because of what David had hidden beneath it. evidence of $100 million legacy and the courage to make sure his children would inherit not just wealth, but truth. Emma, now 3 years old, runs up to me with a flower from the garden. Her smile so like David's it takes my breath away. She has no memory of the cramped apartment in Seattle, the desperate months after her father's death, or the dilapidated shack where we discovered we were heirs to a fortune. Her first clear memories will be of Ravenswood's gardens, her brother's laughter, and the security her father died to provide. That's exactly how David would have wanted it. He fought to give his children the truth and the legacy that was rightfully theirs. And when Richard tried to hide that legacy behind the facade of a worthless shack, he never imagined that a widow with nothing left to lose would tear apart every board, examine every stone, and dig until she found what her husband had died protecting. The cottage still stands at the edge of the property, no longer worthless, no longer collapsing, but preserved as the place where everything changed, where a child's innocent question, "Mama, is this really ours?" began a journey from a dilapidated shack to $100 million vindication, where a husband's final act of love, hiding the truth in the one place his enemies thought held no value, became the foundation of justice for the family he left behind. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, I swear I can hear David's voice in the wind, whispering the words he wrote in that letter. Protect our children. Use this evidence to claim what's theirs. We did, my love. Against all odds, against all opposition we did. The worthless shack you left us contained the most valuable thing of all. The truth that set everything right.